So I've wanted to make this video for a long time and I've been utterly too swamped or otherwise too insecure to bother. Part of the reason for this hesitation is the roller coaster of interpretation from what DE want. 1 minute the partner program's revamped, feedback isn't primarily the intent, and it's like, just go make forum threads, 5head. Alright, cool. I'll just wait until feedback is asked for, he says, knowing how his other threads have gone. Next minute, I'm on Twitter, venting, and it's like, would you mind explaining, giving insight into what makes you feel this way? What? I've made several feedback forum posts with critique and suggestions, but I get a response on a tweet. It did my skull a doozy. I've just decided to get out of my own head about it and just go back to having discussions because I enjoy them. So let's talk about quote unquote endgame. Whenever an endgame discussion comes up, I feel there are a lot of general terms tossed around with no specificity. Content islands, replayability, challenge and or difficulty, cooperation and or teamwork, progression, and raids. First and foremost, the concept of a content island. Controversial take, but content islands aren't an inherently bad concept in my opinion. The term is just used in a general fashion to refer to content that has little to no integration, and that I find is key. A content island in my mind does not necessarily equate to poor integration. I'd argue that we view them through the lens of import integration, what progression from the core of the game transfers to the island, the motivation climate, so the intrinsic and extrinsic value of the content or island itself, and export integration, how the player progresses through the core of the game after engaging in the island. So let's look at an example of this concept. Railjack. For import integration, Railjack is alleviated by previous investments in base Warframe gameplay, focus, and Arcwing systems. For motivation climate, Railjack itself is hit or miss in terms of its intrinsic values. There are people who just do not like the gameplay of Railjack, period. There are people who are fine with the gameplay of Railjack, but find issues with the reward of progression structure, and everything in between, leading up to people who just enjoy the gameplay of Railjack, regardless of the extrinsic values like rewards of progression. In terms of export integrations, excess Railjack resources now have a value due to the helmet system. Intrinsics that benefit Arcwings are granted in non-Railjack Arcwing gameplay, and some of the extrinsic values like the Quailyor or Pennant transfer to the core game. But effectively, once you cap intrinsics and get the weapons, there's no real reason to go back to Railjack. This leads us into the next two concepts of replayability and or sustainability. The reason why the content islands in Warframe are problematic is that there is a finite amount of export integrations. For players that just like Railjack gameplay, they'll likely visit the island just for that intrinsic value. The other two houses of players will likely not return. This has been a problem that the developers have publicly addressed for the longest time, and I quote, not knowing what rewards would be reasonable to keep players invested. The concept of rewards that don't lose extrinsic value are more specifically referred to as evergreen rewards. After a while, relics, and even endo stockpile to the point of nonsense. It would probably take me several years of focusing on nothing but relics to come close to using them all. Specifically in Warframe, we only really have two rewards that would technically fall under the evergreen category, and it's Kuva and Rivens, albeit due to the pure RNG nature and lack of progression in the Riven system. Progression refers in a literal sense of the word's definition, and that is to the process of developing or moving gradually toward a more advanced state. So to specify Rivens having a lack of progression, you are just as likely to end up with something great from 0 rolls as you are from investing millions of Kuva. In core Warframe, progression is acquiring new frames, which add progression through the variety of options, modding, and variants, which can be denoted as priming. The other half of Warframe's progression is its equipment, like weapons that are also affected by modding, but have several variants that make up their progression. The two schools of thought for progression are horizontal progression, where progression comes in the form of different options, and vertical progression, where progression comes in the form of increased power. Many looter games tend to do a meld of both. If we look at Monster Hunter or God Eater, weapons effectively have a tier. A tier 1 sword will do the same total damage as a tier 1 spear. However, enemies have resistances or weak points that affect that damage. This is an example of horizontal progression. But stronger monsters require higher tier weapons, so players craft to improve a weapon's tier, and this is a form of vertical progression, which when combined, personally, I think, gives off a satisfying gameplay loop. I know I can utilize any tier 7 weapon against the highest level creatures, for example. And even if some are more effective or efficient than others, my choices are never really a static hit or miss. In terms of progression consistency, Warframe is all over the place. First off, Warframe uses internal progression of the modding system, but also relies on external additions from Digital Extremes. You can't just say, pick up any Warframe or gun you want and progress it to the point of others. You've got to wait for DE to hand variants to you like an artisanal pizza. For some weapons, a variant means horizontal progression like the Corinth and the Corinth Prime. For other weapons, a variant means vertical progression like the Nucor versus the Kuva Nucor. And there is no level of consistency between the tiers of variants or even weapons of the same MR restriction. This feeds into what I would like to consider the map of access when it comes to endgame content. This refers to the measure of readiness of a player against specific content. For example, Destiny 2's progression system of light level provides a decent map of access when it comes to content like Nightfall and raids. A player can judge whether they are under, over, or appropriately leveled for specific content. There's no real way to gauge this in Warframe. An MR10 player could be just as prepared for raids as an MR25. This is why vague discussions of endgame weigh so heavily on my mind. It's always this goalpost, and I have to wonder how this goalpost is supposed to have any meaning if it's undefined how to reach it. Some players argue that this goalpost should challenge the accumulation of our progression in Warframe, meaning min-max builds, Rivens, focus, etc. And this segue brings us right into everyone's favorite keyword, challenge or difficulty. I'll throw back to one of my favorite extra credits videos that I recommend you watch for yourself. When difficult is fun, challenging versus punishing games, where extra credits makes the key distinction between what makes a game challenging and what makes a game punishing, in which they note concepts that make up good challenge for players, which include consistent game rules, tools and or outlets to approach problems, telegraphing and or affording informed player choices, low iteration time, and usability. Once upon a time, Warframe had raids that effectively failed at 2 through 4. Tools and or outlets to approach you use CC. You used CC and won the game in Law of Retribution. Amisha essentially trivialized Jorda's verdict. What about informed player choices? Well, once you knew the raid, it was really a 5-minute puzzle in the way of killing a boss that took less than a minute to kill. Sadly, as players, we only really get one good experience of figuring out the puzzle before it's just in the way. Not to mention, we're not really at that state where the internet doesn't exist and you can't just find the answer to the puzzle if you don't want to figure it out. Telegraphing? What about everyone's favorite enemy type? Energy Leech Eximus. There's no chance to counter. What informed choices can be made? Low iteration time? Chief. Instead of restarting failed states, players had to fully restart the raid. You would have to redo about 20 minutes of puzzling depending on which section you failed in Law of Retribution. So old raids summarized. You had 2 to 4 people who knew what they were doing and 4 to 6 leeches that could just get carried along for the ride. The only issue was that for Law of Retribution, more people actually meant it took more time to complete because the puzzle's duration scaled with how many players were in the party. Last but not least, that means we're screaming about cooperation. I've went into much more depth in a previous video, but Warframe's design seems more pseudo-cooperative than traditional cooperation. To summarize, pseudo-cooperation is defined by a team of conflicting goals. Due to the nature of Warframe being a 4 murder hobos competing to murder a limited amount of enemies, you can understand how players start to butt heads. For example, Harrow and Trinity aren't really able to appropriately do their jobs if enemies die before reaching their range or line of sight. Cooperation also ties into the map of access, or the developer's reference of design. It's hard to think about what cooperation means in terms of Warframe. Comparatively, games like Mass Effect 3, Anthem, Gears of War, and The Division utilize cooperation to alleviate some of the mechanical struggles of dealing with hordes. But in Warframe, one individual person can just about handle any challenge with flying colors, as noted by Profit Taker speedruns. Cooperation in Warframe, I'd argue, trivializes any concept of challenge. Are they designing content for one unmodded Excalibur, for min-maxed Excaliburs, or the true combination of any and all frames? What even is a reasonable baseline even anymore? Let's not forget, Helminth even threw a wrench into that. Now they have the combination of combinations of combinations. This is why I don't see the discussion of Endgame really bearing any fruit, and it shakes me to my core. The foundations are hardly set to make it just happen and have any meaning, at least in the way people traditionally refer to it in terms of, quote, raids. Ah, yes, raids. The infamous catch-all for what most people consider to be the pinnacle of Endgame. Chief, I remember this concept from MUDs. Look, I won't go into a history lesson, but essentially text-based MMOs. A raid can refer to a group activity in which players challenge either a group of player enemies, like BDO's Node Wars, a horde of AI-controlled enemies, like Diablo's Rift or COD's Zombies, just a powerful boss, or some combination therein. However, it seems it's gotten generalized to only refer to the player versus powerful boss aspect. The closest we have to this in Warframe now is Eidolons, and that should hopefully shed light on some of the misconceptions that, quote, raids will solve Warframe's problems. Granted, the biggest fault line for Eidolons is just not being able to do them when you want. Although raids are an interesting point of design, I feel they hinge on all the other aspects mentioned previous. It never just stops at the one Eidolon or the one, quote, raid. Raids, much like Conclave, Rivens, Railjack, Focus, Archwing, and the other numerous content islands that exist in Warframe are a bit like maintaining a garden. You've got to make sure the foundation of that island is enough to avoid becoming barren too soon, making sure the motivation climate isn't too harsh on the players, or at least providing tools to assist in their adaptation, and occasionally come back and expand on the infrastructure of the island. I partially feel that if DE were to essentially give players what they want without the deeper changes to systems, it'd be a matter of time before people were just looking for the next raid, and the next raid, and the next raid. So let's do a little summary and go back over some of the systems in Warframe with critique and suggestions. Remember that a content island as a concept shouldn't be inherently negative, specifically in regards to Railjack. They mentioned making a lot of positive changes, and then out of nowhere, one of the solutions they mentioned was, it's not just gonna be go play Railjack for 33 to 40 minutes. It's go do Railjack for 5 to 10 minutes. Then you go to the core of Warframe and extract. There's a concept that could be considered over integration. I am looking at you, Destiny 2, where being competitive in PvP isn't as simple as playing PvP. No, 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 no. You've gotta go do raids, quests, or whatever awards the latest broken gear and then go circle back. That being said, I will always give something the chance of hands-on experience, but I do want to voice concerns that depending on how they do this Railjack integration, it could do more harm than good compared to if they just fixed some things and left people the option to go do it or not. Because you'd be testing the people on the far end of just not liking Railjack at all. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of Railjack feedback, but integrating intrinsics, for example, is one step they could take. Let's say having a higher tactical intrinsic makes hacking easier, even if it progresses to the point that players no longer have to hack at all. They could even say reduce Archwing blink, Gravimag arc gun, air support, or Necromech cooldowns. All those things are nice to have and not necessarily impossible to live without. Almost like Borderlands 3 Guardian system. I'll post a link to the entirety of my Railjack feedback below. Let's look at Sanctuary Onslaught. Imagine if it provided Samara standing so users could buy extrinsic rewards they desired. There's no need to farm for 6 months straight to get an ephemera or Warframe set. That means we have to replace the export integration, sure, but fortunately, Samara's has many associations like scanning. Right now, scanning takes a lot away from the core gameplay, but let's say we added effectively all enemies that would fit to Sanctuary Onslaught and paired them with internal upgrades similar to how the scanner was upgraded. Let's say enemies that spawn in Sanctuary Onslaught are increased per level purchased. Sanctuary Onslaught efficiency drain is reduced by X% per level purchased. Sanctuary Onslaught will occasionally spawn synthesis targets that reward bonus standing when scanned. Yes, that would mean the game should equip scanners when pressing the gear button. Let's say enemies have a chance to be scanned when killed in Sanctuary Onslaught. It increases per level purchased. We could even go as far to say affinity gained in Sanctuary Onslaught is increased by X% per level purchased. Do you see how these changes start to provide long-term variation of just Sanctuary Onslaught? Its purpose as a content island is bare minimum for scanning, affinity, and Samara standing, which don't really have many engaging alternative methods. Replayability and sustainability are plausible in Warframe, but the reason I think it's hard is because Warframe's progression is still up in the air. Imagine if Amalgam mods were a system where users could combine one damage mod and one support mod using an Amalgam catalyst. Imagine if users could utilize Syndicate tokens to infuse the elemental Syndicate proc into their weapons. Imagine if investing Umbra Forma onto a Warframe or farming Sacrificial Catalyst essentially gave your Warframe Umbra stats, a way for players to progress their Warframes. Imagine if even weapon variation had more player control. For infested weapons, say you feed cyst to the gun, and suddenly your dual Toxicist gets a slight improvement to a base stat of your choice, but also increases its special effect up to a certain number of times. Wraiths and Vandals could be similar to kit gun guilding. A Wraith guild could increase base damage, crit chance, fire rate, and ammo magazine at the cost of, say, status chance and multi-shot. While a Vandal guild could increase base damage, status chance, and multi-shot at the cost of crit chance, fire rate, and ammo magazine. Look, not perfect examples, but hopefully the point comes across that DE could automate some of the progression, take some of the development weight off their shoulders, and give some of the driving power to the players through systems like that, or by revamping the Riven system so that they're more like Destiny 2's Catalyst. You do certain challenges with a weapon to get its, quote, Riven, and then use Kuva to improve that Riven's effectiveness to some limited extent. I also went into more detail on that in an older video if you would like to listen. Can there be a challenge for our obnoxious power level? Well, there can at least be engagement. Just look at Devil May Cry. The primary way the game challenges you is through variation and reactions. Imagine if there were, say, arbitration drones that made enemies immune to damage, but after using void damage to destroy the drone, that effect fades. What if there were drones or enemy types that needed to be CC'd before they could take damage? A variety of reaction-based decisions could be implemented. Not to mention altering the element system so that players can't just mod to get all the elements and take over the world on one gun, but rely more on cooperation or the mastery of multiple weapons. Does anybody remember the initial Warframe pitch? Nah. To trigger elemental reactions a la Genshin Impact. All that being said, it's easier to say than do. It is hard for me to actually imagine in-game or raids by any definition being tackled in a way to save players right now. Thank you for taking the time and sticking through this monstrosity of a discussion. Hopefully this allows us to express our desires with specificity. I want to remind people that addressing developers with Vitrol is to draw a bow without arrow and wonder why you missed the target. If you're going to give critique, do it with tact, and not like you're wearing a vest of dynamite and chainsaws. I love seeing people passionate about games, but ensure it is not misplaced. If you want more rambling cat brain, you can find me on Twitch or Twitter, and the link's below!